And now once this process completes, we can come over here to our inventory and actually take a look at those virtual machines. Here under Virtual Infrastructure in VMware vSphere, under vCenter Servers is vcenter1.company.pri. And here in our data center, and then on that host right there, will be the 3 machines and 1 template that currently exists on that ESXi host. From right here, I could go about adding a virtual machine to a job by right-clicking the virtual machine and choosing to add it to a backup job. This will take, obviously, that single machine and add it to a job with all the characteristics that we later want to add. But creating individual jobs out of each virtual machine is perhaps not the best approach for how I might want to schedule all these jobs over time. And so rather than adding a single machine to a job, let's instead create a single job and then split out the disks as per VM files. And so to do this, let me actually right-click the vCenter server right here and add it to a backup job. This will expose all the virtual machines on that vCenter server, so I can then select which ones I want to include as part of the job. So for this, I'll call this vCenter1 backup job 1, for example. And down here under next is I'll choose the virtual machines that I want to include. Right here is vCenter1 right here, but this is not actually the virtual machine that I want to back up. Rather, what I'm looking for are the virtual machines that sit inside of vCenter1 or are managed by vCenter1. So let me come down here and add in File1 and then SQL1 right down here. For this, you can see these 2 virtual machines that are now part of this job, and I do want to remove vCenter1 from the job. I do this because the vCenter server, at least in this environment, is not actually on that ESXi host. And so I'm going to constrain things here just to File1 and SQL1, and if I recalculate here, you'll see that the total size for the job will be about 26 gigabytes in size. Now before I go any further, I want to show you the exclusions button right up here. For either of these virtual machines, if I wanted to exclude, for example, a virtual machine as an object, a disk from one of those virtual machines, or even a template, for example, if I'm worried about backing up virtual machine templates, I could exclude those here by clicking the Excludes button. One of the more common uses of this exclusions is right over here under Disks, where for any of the virtual machines, we can remove any of the selected disks out of those that we care about here for the backup job. I want to back up the entire virtual machine in both cases here, both File and SQL1. And so let's add these to our backup job and associate that here with our storage. Now for this, we can first determine which backup proxy we want to use. The automatic selection here will probably end up selecting the correct proxy 1 machine right down here, or I could choose to use the selected ones only. I'm going to allow the automatic selection to choose the right proxy. That proxy is that virtual machine sitting there in the environment that has a more direct access to the VMDK files. Right down here, we can also choose our backup repositories. Recall that we created our DAS repository, our NAS repository over there in the disaster recovery site, and then this scale-out repository here as well. For now, let me just back up the content here to my DAS repo and keep 14 restore points there on disk. Now here in just a second, we'll later be configuring some secondary destinations for this job, but we can't actually configure them yet because we haven't done some of the backup copy setup work that's required. And so you'll see here we get a bit of an error message if I try to select the secondary destinations at this point. After you configure those backup copy locations, each subsequent job will be able to use this checkbox here, but we've got a bit of work we have to do yet first. Now down here under Advanced, and this is probably the wrong word for this button because it probably should say click down here for more configurations. But here under Advanced is where we go about now configuring the type of backup job that we want to set up. Earlier I showed you the forever forward, the forward, and the reverse incremental jobs. And you can see at least 2 of them here visually in the interface. The reverse incremental is right up here and it's listed as slower. The incremental is listed down here as recommended. And at this point, with no further configuration, we are automatically going to set up a forever forward job. Where we go about converting it from a forever forward to a forward job is by choosing to create active full backups periodically or to create synthetic full backups periodically right up here. Either of these 2 checkboxes will then create the necessary full backups occasionally, either by copying down the entire contents of that virtual machine again, or by synthetically assembling them together from previous backups to create that closer restore point should we need to restore that virtual machine. Recall that we are using a ReFS volume there on our Windows machine, so we can do these synthetic full backups right over here. We could also create active full backups on certain days as well. And you could determine which of these you want to choose if you want to create a full backup every so often, just in case as a protectionary measure against the synthetic full backups, you can do that. Over here, I can choose which days we go about creating those synthetic full backups. So for example, if we were doing Sunday, maybe we choose Wednesday, for example, is when that synthetic full backup would be created. I can do the same down here as far as choosing which days I would want to for my full backups as well. Again, if neither of these two checkboxes are checked, we'll actually create a forever forward backup and not a forward incremental like what we're probably looking for here. When we are creating these backups here, we can also do some maintenance activities on them as well, like performing a health check here every so often, or doing full backup file maintenance, like removing deleted items or defragmenting and compacting that full backup file. Be aware here that this defragmentation and compacting is unnecessary when periodic fulls are enabled. And so if I hit the OK button here, you'll get a little error message here that reminds you that the defragment and compact functionality is unnecessary when you're doing periodic full backups. This defragmentation and compaction functionality becomes necessary in the case that the process of creating ever more incrementals may have the chance of creating corruption there in that file or all the files associated with that chain. And so if you don't occasionally create full backups, well, sometimes it's a good idea to defragment and compact that full backup file just so that you know you aren't introducing corruption into the restore later on. Let me then unselect both of these so we can continue on, but I'll still continue to perform that backup file health check here to detect and auto-heal any corruption that's found. Here under storage is where I configure which of the data reduction activities I also want to incorporate into the transfer, like data deduplication or exclude any swap file blocks or deleted file blocks. There are several compression levels here that determine how much I want to compress the data before sending it to the repository. Do be aware that the higher order compression levels can trade a significantly additional amount of CPU utilization for what is really not all that much of an additional compression. So in many circumstances, if not most, the optimal compression level is that which is recommended. Down here also, we can choose where our storage optimization will occur, whether it occurs on the local target, the LAN target, or a WAN target. This local target storage optimization option, as you can see, offers better performance at the cost of a lower deduplication ratio and just more storage there on disk. And so we'll select that as our storage optimization option right down here. And if you want, you can actually encrypt in the backups also, but as you might imagine, this requires some significant CPU on both sides to first encrypt the data, send it along the wire, and then decrypt the data here at the repository side. And so for our purposes here, we won't actually enable backup file encryption with the assumption then that all of our data is going across our local area network. There are some notifications we can configure up here like SNMP and email notifications. We can also here determine if we want to enable VMware Tools quiescence in addition to or in place of the VSS quiescence that we'll be enabling here. For many of your virtual machines, particularly your Windows virtual machines, it is the VSS quiescence that's going to give you a better restore experience than what you would get here out of VMware Tools alone. We can safely enable this because we'll also later be enabling guest processing down here in the next item in the wizard. But for your other non-VSS virtual machines, this is the option you have for quiescing the guest before that backup is actually taken. In most situations, you also want to enable the use of change block tracking data and the use of CBT for all protected VMs automatically. The CBT experience will be better than going to the metadata there in the repository to figure out which blocks have changed. And so in every case here, you'll see us checking both of these boxes here for change block tracking. Here under integration is where I can enable that backup from storage snapshots instead of virtual machine snapshots. If your virtual environment supports the use of storage snapshots, you can get away from actually having to involve the hypervisor as part of these VM snapshots as part of this backup job. And so I'll leave the checkbox enabled here, but we'll probably be using traditional VM snapshots in the environment we're configuring here. Then lastly, here under scripts is where we can define a script to execute before the job as well as after the job. These are commonly done to prepare applications or clean up databases or any of the usual housekeeping activities that are required to ensure that that application can be recovered successfully. For these, we have none of the scripts that we want to include here, but right here is where you'll actually add them to the job. Once I hit OK here, that now configures our advanced items here for the job. Again, you really want to go to the advanced items for pretty much any job you create. I told you that there are two different places where guest quiescence can occur, with the first being VMware Tools quiescence that we saw just a second ago. The second is VSS oriented, and it's right here in this screen where we can enable application-aware processing for our virtual machines. Right down here where we can define what applications we actually want to use application-aware processing for. Here you can see for the different kinds of applications, what different kinds of activities do we want to require. For this, let me choose Edit right over here and show you the different processing settings for SQL, for Oracle, and also some general application settings as well. If I have, for example, a database or an application where I want a successful VSS result code as part of the whole job processing, I'll choose here to require successful processing for this to be considered a successful backup. I could also ignore the failures or just disable application processing if for some reason it's not interfacing with VSS. Down here also, your SQL administrators sometimes have their own processes for backing up their databases. And so when that's the case, you may not want your Veeam activities to get in the way of whatever alternative approaches that those SQL administrators are using. Right over here, this is the case for SQL Server, for Oracle, for Exchange, and so on. If you do have an alternative solution that you're using to back up those databases, you may want to perform a copy-only backup here, where you're not actually processing those transaction logs. If Veeam is the only solution you're using to perform this backup, well, then you'll just process the transaction logs with the job, like right here. Down here, we can also choose to truncate or not truncate the logs, which essentially is the same thing like what I discussed a second ago. If we are using other solutions to perform SQL backups, you probably won't want to truncate the logs, or you can choose to after the backup completes, or even after a period of time right down here. The same holds true with Oracle, where we can do some archival of logs. We can identify our Oracle account, that which has sysdpa privileges. Right over here also, we can identify some file exclusions. Be aware here that if you do enable the exclusion of certain files and folders, this can have the effect of increasing the resource utilization to complete the backup job there on the actual virtual machine. The reason for this is that the job itself will have to dig into the virtual machine to understand which files and folders need to be excluded. And so if you don't really have a reason to exclude files, it's usually a good idea to disable file level exclusions like what you can see up here. And so I'll leave this as disable because I don't want to require those extra processing activities to occur on the VM during the processing of the job. Lastly, also are some scripts here, just like what we saw before, where we can require a successful script execution, ignore any failures, or just disable script execution entirely. And right here is where you would define what those scripts will be. This is for file 1, but we may need to also complete this for SQL 1 as well. SQL 1 is obviously a SQL server, so I'm going to assume that we want to go through all the activities to successfully back up SQL 1. This includes the truncation of logs, the requiring here of successful processing, the processing of transaction logs there with the job, and then actually truncating the logs here because this is the only solution we're using to back up this SQL server. Once we define what these processing options are over here, we can lastly determine if we want to also enable guest file system indexing. This will allow you later on to restore individual files and folders out of this virtual machine because you'll have gathered an index of all those files and folders. Now for this, you can define some advanced settings right over here, essentially determining which of the disks you want to index. But again, if you do plan on actually needing to restore individual files and folders, it's usually a good idea to go through the extra processing required to index that virtual machine disk file after the backup completes. For this, we also need to identify our guest OS credentials, and it's right here where, again, I want to highlight the use of a local administrator account to complete the task. If you have not disabled UAC in your environment through group policy or individually, you will need to use a local administrator account to accomplish this task. Now, in this environment, I'm using the same administrator username and password for all of my machines. And so for that, I can actually add in an additional account right over here that will be that local admin account. Let's choose to add in a new standard account right here. And for that, I'll punch in my administrator username with its associated password. Again, this whole problem with UAC and the use of a local admin account is going to be necessary if our guest interaction proxy is to be able to inject that necessary activity there into the virtual machine to complete all these pre and post backup tasks. Now, earlier I talked about that guest interaction proxy, and I told you that there wasn't really much we could see until we started actually creating the backup job. Right down here is where we can define which machine should be that guest interaction proxy. And as before, we have all the different machines that are currently here in the backup infrastructure as options. I can choose either of these if I want, if perhaps I want to separate out this site versus another, but I'll choose automatic selection here to allow Veeam to accomplish the task. You will want to make sure to test this process before actually creating the job, because if the guest interaction proxy is unsuccessful in deploying out that piece of code it requires, your backup job is not going to be easily restorable in the way that you might want. You can see here that we have success in both of these cases by using that local administrator account. And so let me choose close down here and next to schedule the job. For this, I can determine how I want that job to be scheduled. So do I want to run it every day or every month or every hour or after another job? Out of all of these, it's perhaps this after this job configuration down here at the bottom that could potentially be the most useful. If you have a variety of different virtual machines whose processing requires each other, you may want each of these virtual machines or the jobs that contain these different virtual machines to run in a specific order, essentially one right after the other. But if that's the case, running one job after the other can ensure the separation of the processing for those different virtual machines or groups of virtual machines. Finally, we have some automatic retry settings down here and whether we want to terminate the job if it goes outside of our backup window. If you've determined perhaps the late night hours is your backup window, and if it goes beyond that window, let's not impact the regular day's operations, you can do so right down here. I'm going to choose the Apply button here, and to run the job here, to begin this process of backing up these two virtual machines, SQL1 and File1.